Classic, a book which people praise but don't read. Mark Twain. You're listening to AMI Audiobook Review. I'm your host, Jacob Szymanski. Mark Twain has a few quotes attributed to him where he shows cynicism towards our reverence of so-called classic books. That quote was way back from the late 1800s, and I'd say it's still relevant today. Case in point, all the boring classics we have to read in high school English. I'll let producer Nisreen Abdelmajid take over from here.
Joining us today is Ryan Hooey, an avid audiobook listener who also is a regular contributor on Kelly and Ramya on his featured segments called the Chatty Bookshelf. He's here to chat about a couple of things. First, we are reviewing The Pearl by John Steinbeck, a classic novella. And second, we chat about how classic books like these inevitably make it into high school English curriculums and how they can be a huge disservice to young readers. Jacob, English class could be so much better, wouldn't you agree?
We're going to get into this. This is
the sigh says it all.
We've had emails back and forth for the past couple weeks. Like, we had an idea going into this segment, like full transparency. The plan was to read 3 classic novellas, all of which published before 1947, I think. And we were supposed to do that with Ryan, and Ryan hated the first one he read and told us just a quick little note. It reminded me of high school English class, and I got you and I thinking about how English class really does suck, and it's a huge disservice to all the young readers that could be enjoying books so much more. Ryan has been listening in. Let's bring him in. Ryan Hooey is a regular contributor to AMI Audiobook Review and an avid bookworm. What's up, Ryan? How's it going?
I'm good. I see my, I guess where I am on this podcast and on this television show. I'm the evil guy. I'm the non-agreeer. I'm okay with that. I'll cause a ruckus if you guys want me to. But it's interesting. Hate's a strong word. I know I used it in email and you have it on file, but I don't know that hate's the wrong word. Like, the writing was fantastic. Like, I will give The Pearl that. Like, the writing was great. It was just ho-hum for me for a number of reasons, and you touched on the one. It felt like I was in English class being forced to read this, and the test was coming next week, so remember these details or remember this little thing, and I found myself drifting or not paying attention or just maybe not enjoying it would be the right way to, because it was, and I'm not saying you forced me gun to my head to read the book, right? It wasn't like that. However, that's the way I felt. And it got me thinking too, like, what other books are like this, or what other books have maybe, and I have a couple of interesting ones to kind of discuss a little bit later. But yeah, that's the way I felt. I mean, I'm a big sports guy. Who doesn't love the underdog story? Like, The Pearl is the ultimate underdog story. Like, I don't, so it's like I should have liked it by all intents and purposes, but I couldn't get past sitting in that school uniform in 2002 in grade 12 English and just wishing I was outside instead.
I wonder what specific aspect of the book made you feel that way. Was it just because it was old, the writing style, the literary style? We will get to the conversation about high school English class, but since we're talking about The Pearl here, Niz, do you want to read us the synopsis just so that we're all on the same page?
Absolutely. Like his father and grandfather before him, Kino is a poor diver, gathering pearls from the Gulf beds that once brought great wealth to the kings of Spain and now provide Kino, Juana, and their infant son with meager subsistence. Then on a day like any other, Kino emerges from the sea with a pearl as large as a seagull's egg, as perfect as the moon. With the pearl comes hope, the promise of comfort and of security. A story of classic simplicity based on a Mexican folktale, The Pearl explores the secrets of man's nature, greed, and the darkest depths of evil, and the luminous of possibilities of love.
This is a story that's all about pointing out the old saying that money is the root of all evil. And in the story, Kino gets a gigantic, hugely valuable pearl, but when he thinks he got his fortune, what he actually brought upon himself was evil. And everybody around him changed his attitudes towards him because of the immense value that he had on his person. Where he thought the pearl was going to change his life, it actually ruined it. Now, what's cool is that this book came out in the mid 1940s, and it seems to predict the predicament that people who win modern day lotteries, how they win huge fortunes but only end up bankrupt, and they say that it ruins their lives. The first modern lottery happened in the early 1960s, so it basically predicted it from over 15 years before, which I thought was really cool. You mentioned it earlier, Ryan, that it's a beautifully written book. The prose are gorgeous, and has a very unique writing style, very, very artful.
No, you're right. And I think it takes some getting used to, I will admit, at least on my part, and maybe I'm just not as cultured or sophisticated as the next. However, I think that once you get used to it, it gets better. And I will say the same for the narrator. At least the one I listened to, it was interesting, and I think that has a lot to do with my decision. The narration is so key, and I know you can't take things away from the author or blame the author for that, but I think people sometimes forget that that's a huge piece to it as well. Mm-hmm. And the thing that I did like about it, I mean, I've been more negative than anything at this point, but the thing I did love about it was the rags to riches. However, I'm going to sit here and say, I wanted more rags to riches. I wanted more of that controversy. And maybe this is my social media mentality, what we see today, what we're reading today, where it's like, it is quite different. Like you said, it was written in the 40s, and comparable to 2024, what we say is like the ultimate greed story is scandal story is much different. And I think maybe that's on me to not expect that, or to change my expectations going in, because maybe that had an effect on it as well.
So was this an issue that arose from you not really knowing what you were getting yourself into? Like, what kind of research did you do about this book before going into it? Because it seems like that had a huge effect.
You know what? I research-wise, I try not to do anything except the synopsis. I don't like to read reviews because it'll cloud my judgment. I'm just that type of thinker, and not everybody is. People will go in and read tons of reviews and be like, "Oh, I'm not going to read it because 9 out of 10 said it was not good." But as for research, I don't do much, and that's even in my own personal reading too. For instance, I'm reading something right now about the Dallas Cowboys. It's called Boys Will Be Boys. It's about the 90s, where they were hugely famous, winning all the championships. However, there was a tons of scandal and stuff in the back. And even that, to me, is different scandal, even though it's high class, high craze, but it's different than it would be today. And I'm wondering if that played a big part. Like, I was sitting there reading this book, and I think I can't tell you exactly how far in. We'll do minutes. I think I was maybe 25, 30 minutes in, and I'm like, oh, I'm in English class. And then I was like, I felt like, because it was the way it was written, and this is not to say it's wrong or it's bad, it was just the way it was written, the way it was being spoken to me. I'm like, oh, this is, again, 2002, my teacher reading this out loud, or me trying to read this because, like, hey, read to yourself over there. And I couldn't get past that. And that was me. That was my kind of thing. I don't want to say I was checked out at that point, because I did finish it. However, I'm just, it was a struggle. Let's put it that way, to say the least.
The way it's written is pretty unique. There's one style that John Steinbeck uses, which is it's up to interpretation. Like, I think some people would find it artful and tasteful, and others would find it kind of pretentious, where he often talks about the characters' songs within them. And I think the songs are meant to represent emotions in states of being, and I think it's supposed to tie towards, like, the indigenous peoples that live off the coast of California doing this pearl diving, which is the background of the main character in the book, Kino. And he also uses a lot of what English teachers might call a run-on sentence with a lot of ands and sentences that never feel like they end. I have an excerpt that portrays like both these elements. Let me read it for you. For context, this is a scene early on in the book after Kino's baby gets stung by a scorpion. Because the doctor doesn't want to accept them because they don't have the money, Kino and his wife go pearl diving, hoping to find a pearl so that they can pay for the treatment for their baby. Kino's wife is on the boat praying while Kino is underwater collecting oysters, hoping to find pearls in them. Here's the excerpt. Now, Kino's people had sung of everything that happened or existed. They had made songs to the fishes, to the sea in anger, and to the sea in calm, to the light, to the dark, and to the sun, and to the moon. And the songs were all in Kino and in his people. Every song that had ever been made, even the ones forgotten. And as he filled his basket, the song was in Kino. And the beat of the song was his pounding heart as it ate the oxygen from his held breath. And the melody of the song was the gray-green water, and the little scuttling animals, and the clouds of fish that fleeted by and were gone. But in the song, there was a secret little inner song, hardly perceptible but always there, sweet and secretive and clinging, almost hiding in the counter-melody. And this was the song of the pearl that might be, for every shell thrown in the basket might contain a pearl. I can't fathom writing at this level. This is linguistic jujitsu. How are you not moved? Like, I hear everything you just said, but the level of this writing, in my opinion, almost overwrites any kind of trauma that's bringing you back towards high school English.
And you know what? It was funny because I decided against it, but after you finished the exit, I was like, "Hey, Teach, can I hit that? Can I go to the bathroom?" Like that's what I was thinking the entire time, right? Like, I'm trying to get out of here, right? But it's interesting because it is, and I like when you know what, when you read it, it's not different, but it sounds different than the narrator. And do you want to know what I heard? When you were describing the scene, and this is what I thought of when I read it too. This is John Q with the movie John Q with my boy Denzel doing the same thing to get his son the heart surgery he needs. This is the exact same thing. It was just a more simple world back then, I guess, would be the way to put it, where and that's, maybe it's not as, maybe we're desensitized as a culture, as a society. I don't want to get too deep into it, but maybe that's where I'm coming from. But I don't know, because I agree with you. I absolutely agree with you. It's beautifully written. It's maybe it would change it if I was reading it off the page instead of listening to someone else.
Maybe
there's an interpretation thing. I'm not sure if that has something. I'm not trying to make excuses. Like, I'll be the first to admit I didn't like it, it's hard for me because I hate saying that I don't like books, especially ones that I'll say I'm supposed to like because it's a classic, because it's sold 50,000 million copies. You know what I mean? Like, I know that number doesn't exist, but it's just, I feel like as much as I want to go against the grain, I want to join in and be like, yeah, you liked it and you're talking about this. I'm like, oh, I hated that. And I was thinking about a Denzel Washington movie while you're you know what, it's a really strange spot for me to be in.
Do you think part of it is not just that the book is old, but that it's taking place in a time that's not modern, right? Like, we just can't really relate to pearl diving, right? Like, it could have taken place in a much more modern setting. What do you think, Naze?
Yeah, I feel that. I feel like there's so many books like these that I can't really grasp. I agree with you, Ryan, on there's so many levels where these books, you feel like it's a drag. It's a drag to read. You're really pushing yourself. You're forcing yourself to read it or to listen to it. So it does feel like an assignment more than really pleasure. And when it comes to these, like, I can't relate to it. I can't really grasp the words. It doesn't, bring me in. And part of that is relating to our society, our day and age, modern cultures. Like, that's how it is.
Something I noticed about books coming out nowadays, or anything like past like 1990, I'd say, roughly, is that modern books feel more like movies and TV shows. There's more cliffhangers, they're more snappy, whereas books that came out before that, they have this literary style that you couldn't possibly turn into a movie, because it's less about the characters and the plot, and it's much more about the themes and the symbolism and the scenario, and it's supposed to make you think, and you're supposed to let the words wash over you like it's a like you're a Sunday and someone's pouring chocolate over you, which is how I feel.
That's another Cotton Time thing, right? Only because you say it, like, even nowadays, a lot of the books I read, like, I'll admit I'm mostly a science fiction thriller. I want the blockbuster movie type deal, right? And there's swearing in those books. There's, you know, the LOLs, the short-term language, and you're not going to find that in a Steinbeck book. It didn't exist back then. And if you even tried to put even something that's not quite a swear word, but, you know, could be on the border, you don't want your child to say kind of thing. If he tried to put that in a book, the publisher would be like, nope, this is smut, or whatever they would call it back then, right? So it's interesting to me that we've come to a certain point in society where it's like, oh, this is okay, and this is, in terms of a classic for the 2000s or whatever, as opposed to this one it's aged well, and it's timeless from the 40s, right? Despite me not liking it.
It's so important for characters to be relatable isn't the right word. You want them to feel real. You want them to feel like they're real people, that you can believe that they exist in the world, that they've been written in. The problem is the people back then are so different from us now, not just in the technology that they have, but also in values, right? This you can read in books, like, and it really shows up in the Pearl here, like gender roles, right? And they're not questioned whatsoever, whereas books that come out like nowadays, characters are a lot more their values align more with our own, and for those reasons they just feel more realistic.
I don't know if you guys do this, but I always tend to find myself, no matter what I'm listening to, no matter what I'm reading for, I look for a couple of different things in the book, and I sort of, I don't want to say hyper focus on them, but the one I'm about to mention is I really hyper focus on it, and I couldn't in this one because I couldn't find it. And I wonder if that's, 40s versus 2000s writing style, but I always look for the character that you love to hate. I mean, it could have been done back then, but I couldn't hate anybody in this book. Like, that was another thing. I just hated that I was picturing my teacher reading it to me. That's kind of what I think it was, the ambiance and the setting of not even the book, just the setting it brought me back to. It's like, do you read for nostalgia? And this one, I would say absolutely not. But other times where it's like, hey, I've read this book and it brought me back to the swing set in the schoolyard or whatever, because it was cool, or I was climbing the tree to read that book, the Goosebumps book or whatever it was. Like, those would be cool things, but I couldn't even find a character to love to hate. Like, I love to not so much pick on that character, but focus on, like, oh yeah, they're a jerk, but like, you love to hate them. They're the New York Yankees of this book, kind of thing.
Yeah, it felt like, other than the wife and Kino, there were no characters that felt like they were reoccurring, right? Every other character was very
come and go,
fleeting. Yeah, exactly. So we disagree about this book, you and I, Ryan, but we don't disagree that English class sucks. And I think you agree with us too, Niz.
Yes.
I want to ask you both, but let's start with you, Niz. What do you remember from high school English class?
I remember I hated every second of it, and every year. That was it's crazy. That's the class that I hated the most. I loved math class. I loved science class, but English class was the worst. I remember learning about Shakespeare every year, and I understand the aspect of it, of like why it's important to learn it. But I feel like it's done with. Teach it for one semester. All right, move on. We get it. But that's the the worst part of it all. I feel like, you know, high school kids deserve to study stories that represent and validate their experiences and cultures. I think that would be
Yes,
important
yeah.
for the development. It's time for Shakespeare to be set aside and de-emphasized to make room for modern and more diverse and more inclusive choices.
Ryan, what about you?
I agree. I picture it. Ryan was cited back in these days, right? So I was going through it, and the first thing you did was look at the syllabus. What are we reading? And then you just, again, or like you said, oh, maybe it's not Romeo and Juliet, but it's Othello or something else. And it's the same thing. I mentioned that Shakespeare is one of mine. It's beautiful. It's great. It's a classic, absolutely. But how many kings have you met where it's like, oh, they're evil and they're trying to make me eat a poison apple or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, it almost seems like to some kids that are watching TikToks and stuff these days, they'd be like, well, that's not cool. But then again, you know, for the Disney movies that are still out, it's like that's relevant and very cool to some. So it's interesting. I remember those, but I do remember a couple of good books. And now this whole conversation that we've been having got me thinking, like, how difficult it must be for a teacher, because I don't do they even like reading these books, or are they being in a sense forced to as well? Oh, they're in grade 11, so they have to read Romeo and Juliet or whatever the case might be, right? Yeah. Or is it, oh, I love this and I can't wait to read it again? Where plus you're dealing with a bunch of 16-year-olds that absolutely will probably hate this and not do what you want them to do. So I was just looking at it, I'm like, who makes the reading list? And as Jacob's question at the beginning of the segment, how do we change it, or how do we make this better or more likable for students?
Who does make the reading list? That's a really good question. But whoever gets to make that list has a huge amount of power, because what gets me is that if you turn off young readers from reading because their experience in high school English is awful and boring and doesn't stimulate them, then they're not going to read. It's not going to promote them for reading for the rest of their lives.
This is actually a reason why I stopped reading for a while, is just because there was some books that we were forced to read in high school, like To Kill a Mockingbird, for example. That was one book that we were forced to read, and I didn't enjoy it because we were forced to read it. After high school, I took a chance and I read it again, and I enjoyed it. It's a big difference there.
And here's one on the flip side for you. So The Great Gatsby, another one you usually read in high school, another classic. I hated it in high school. Do you want to know what changed my mind? And this is really weird, so I'm sure this will spark a whole nother side conversation. The movie that came out with the modern day-esque movie of it, and I think it was just called Gatsby. When I watched that, I'm like, oh, this is actually cool. I understand it a little more. I'm going to go back and read the book. Loved it. And that's never really happened with any other book in like the high school genre for me. So I'm wondering, there's a relation thing. It's like Niz mentioned To Kill a Mockingbird. How many kids these days have ever walked up to the wall to answer the phone that's on a cord? You know what I mean? Just a simple example, but that's how they communicated. It's like, hey, let's turn on the radio and listen to it as a family. What's a radio? Like, it's really interesting. Like, I wonder. And I hate to say, do we change the classics, or I'm like, do we update the classics, or there's been so many good ones that have been like done, and I get it, it's love it or hate it, right? But there's been some really bad ones too. So I'm wondering, maybe there's a way to update that reading list, or do we make it a happy medium? Keep your Shakespeare's, do 2 of those. If you're doing 4 books a year, do 2 of those, and do 2, I don't want to say fun books, but something that the kids might enjoy, like a thriller or a romance or a whatever kind of thing that might have some hidden lessons or something in it. I don't know. I mean, maybe that's more difficult, but it seems so simple to me to just have that happy medium. And again, you're never going to make everybody happy, but to start, instead of, piling on old book after old book after old book, and then, hey, here's the test on them. And if you don't deem what's important that the teacher does, then sorry, you failed the test.
You're listening to AMI Audiobook Review. I'm your host, Jacob Szymanski. I'm talking to Ryan Hooey and Nisrin Majid about English high school class and how it could be so much better, and how it does a disservice to young readers. One of the things I think we could be doing so much better is, Ryan, I'll be honest, I completely disagree. No more Shakespeare at all. Shakespeare, this might be a hot take, is completely irrelevant nowadays. Maybe not in the entire context of like English literature. Obviously, he's hugely influential. Keep that for university studies. Like, it's way too complicated for high school students. Like, the fact that we need to read a book with a million annotations and modernizations and stuff like that it proves its own point, that it's way too complicated for high school students.
Yeah.
And I think they should be doing a much bigger effort in finding books that resonate with young readers. I'm thinking about books like The Fault in Our Stars by John Green. That's a book that they actually had kids reading at my high school. And last year that I was there, I saw a giant pile of that book, and people were excited to read it. They really loved it. And that specific book is great because one of the big things that people love about it is that it really respects the emotional depth of young adults and adolescents. And I think that's something that young readers will love to see reflected.
It's interesting because when you look at the Shakespeare take, right, it's funny because I'm going to age myself again, but back in high school, we didn't go and read the book. We went and spent the $20 on the cliff notes of Romeo and Juliet written in English so that we could understand what was going on rather than the Elizabethan that it is written in.
What's the point?
Right, exactly, because you weren't going to understand it at all. And I love that we can incorporate some of the things that you said, you know, like that resonate with the students. I think that's so important because I think the learning is important, but the fact of getting kids to love to read, whether it's aging again, newspaper, news, whatever kind of thing, after that, reading for the joy of it, not just reading because you're being told to.
Niz, how do you think we could be making English classes better?
Yeah, I have to admit, I feel embarrassed admitting this, but I never understood Shakespeare all 4 years of high school. Like I was just going through English class like, yeah, it was it was a dull moment there. But I do agree with you guys. I feel like there has to be representation for the students. I mean, I feel like that should be we could include more inclusive, more diverse choices, more modern choices with these books. And I feel like that will push more students to read and want to read. They'll feel like it's more, you know, for pleasure rather than, you know, being forced, and it feels like a drag to them. I feel like the students should choose what to read.
And you can limit the choices too, right? You can create a pool of books that they can choose from, right? You can choose from these 10 books, and there's a variety, and they can write a book report on it or do some sort of assignment, like a marketing assignment where they have to write positively about the book to try and sell it, you know, that type of thing. But the point is, you don't have to read one book. You have to choose between 10 books or something, and you can cherry pick. So you can say they're all moderns in this batch, and then this other batch here for like the second semester, like these are classics. Like we're gonna read like one classic per year. Like there's so many options.
I think that's fair.
I remember.
I love that idea.
Yeah, right. Just give people the choice, because if you have to read one book, it feels forced upon you. If you have to choose 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 5 or whatever configuration, then at least you feel like you had some sort of agency in this, and it's all about.
And I guarantee that kids will, you know, I chose 1 out of 10 of this genre or the classics or whatever. I bet you're like, oh, this one actually sounded good too. Maybe I'll read this on my own, and it might draw them in to read other air quotes classics or whatever that are on the list that maybe they didn't, but Susie in front of them did and said, oh, I loved it. So maybe they take that review and do their thing with that.
I remember in 12th grade they introduced The Hunger Games as one of the books we were going to read, and everyone was so hyped. It was awesome. Like everybody read that book because when it was popular in the zeitgeist. Guys, I want to thank you. Yes. Guys, I want to thank you so much. This was such a good talk. I hope English teachers got some ideas. Ryan, thank you so much.
Have a great day, guys.
Nisreen, you too. I'll talk to you tomorrow.
Thank you.
That was Ryan Hooey. He's a regular contributor to AMI Audiobook Review and an avid bookworm. And I was also Nisreen Abdulmajid. She's a producer on AMI Today. That's all the time we have for AMI Today. If you missed any of our conversations, you can find a repeat of AMI Today wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find a repeat every 8 hours on AMI Audio. You can also find the show on YouTube after it finishes airing, but also check it out wherever you find your podcasts. We chop up the audio digests, the feature interviews, and the AMI audiobook review segments separately. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern on AMI Audio and YouTube. I'm your host, Jacob Shamansky. Thanks for listening.